Hello, and welcome to CIT 245 Game Design on Paper. I'm Professor Olsch, and today we're going to be talking about basic game mechanics. When we talk about game mechanics, we talk about the different things that make a game work, whether it's their rules or the flow of gameplay, the things that players can do to interact with the game. These are what we consider game mechanics. So, the first thing that we want to do is we want to discuss what is a game. How do you define a game versus an activity? Games have to have a couple of different aspects to them to really be considered games. So they need to have a structure and rules, which is to say that they need to have a way to play the game, rules that players have to follow, and a clear through line from beginning to conclusion. They also have to have challenges and goals, which is goals can be a way to win the game, a way to complete the game. If it's a co-op game, how the players succeed or fail in whatever their mission is. If it's a competitive game, how does one player win? How do other players lose? As well as the challenges that disrupt the player's ability to achieve those goals. You want to give players a way to a difficulty to accomplishing what they're trying to do, because if something is too easy, if there's no challenge in the game, then there's not a lot of fun to be had when they actually do complete the game. The next component is engagement and interaction, which is, as I say simply in the slide, it's provides opportunities for players to engage with each other as well as the game itself. And I find this to be kind of the most important aspect in game design. Outside of the next part, which is entertainment and fun, you to really define a game versus an activity, you need to have some kind of engagement or interaction between players and the game itself, players and other players. There's a famous a quote from Mark Rosewater, the lead designer of Magic the Gathering. He is asked, "What is a game?" And he explains that it has to have players have to have a impact on the game state itself through decisions that they've made, which is to say that the difference between something like Monopoly and something like Candyland, whereas Monopoly has a bunch of different components that you have to balance. You have to balance the money that you have by and selling properties, developing on those properties, and there's a lot of things that the player has to decide to accomplish their goal. Versus Candyland, which the only thing that changes in Candyland is um, the order of the cards in the deck, and the player themselves has no interaction with anything that goes on in the game. You just draw a card and you move to where that card tells you to move. So we look at Candyland as more of an activity than Monopoly, which has that interaction and can be considered a game. The final component, which is, again, probably more important than anything else, is entertainment and fun. People play games to have fun. Games can be used for learning opportunities, training, things like that. But at the end of the day, the way that people want to interact with games is they want to have fun with them. If you design a game that is so complicated or so against the player that they don't have any fun doing what they're doing, they're not going to play your game again. So we want to make sure when we design games that we care about how much fun the player is having. So that is how we would define a game. So let's define some fundamental game mechanics. I split these into three categories, and they're very broad, but they're kind of the major components that you find in most games. Action, which is any kind of thing that defines what players do during a turn, in the course of the game, in reaction to other people doing things. This is your flow of the game. This can include things such as actual actions that players take, disrupting other players' ability to play the game or move or interact with any component of the game, and also performing things to help them win the game. The next major part of this umbrella is resource management. So most in about, I would say, 99% of games that exist on paper, there is something that you have to keep track of in order to do well in the game. For something that's more obvious, like Settlers of Catan, where you're keeping track of your actual resources, your different uh, cards, different cities and things, and on the tiles, those are all parts of resource management. But when you look at a game like, say, chess or checkers, your resource management are the pieces you have in play. You have to, especially in a game like chess, where you have to make decisions that will allow your opponent to take your pieces in exchange for your opponent's pieces. Things like, you have to balance the pieces that you have in the game and how that will affect you in the future and your ability to win. And the last thing on this list is scoring. Scoring can mean anything from gaining victory points through game mechanics, defeating enemies, defeating your opponent in Magic by reducing their life total, and other victory conditions in your game. So let's talk about a couple of the different ways actions and other parts of this umbrella really work in game design. So a lot of games you'll see have a component of randomness or chance in them. This could be things like dice rolls, cards, spinners, pulling things out of a bag, whatever element of chance that you want to add to a game. A lot of this can be very important for giving replayability to a game. So in a game like chess, which is a solved game, which is to say that all of the pieces are publicly available and known, and their positions and what they can do. The only thing that is different is how each player plays that game, versus something like, let's go back to Monopoly, where you roll the dice every turn to figure out how many spaces you move, or you draw your chance or community chest cards to get effects during the game. Randomness can add a lot of fun to the game, but if there is too much chance and not enough player influence on the game, then it can feel like you do not have any control, and you're leaning towards that activity versus game territory. A game that is 100% chance is Candyland, where the only thing that happens in the game is drawing a card off the top of a deck. Very important part of gameplay is player interaction. Outside of solitaire-like games, like solitaire, or one-player board games or card games, player interaction is the biggest component in playing in the actual playing of a game. Is you'll have multiple players and they all are interacting one way or the other. We kind of separate these versions of player interaction based off of whether or not it's cooperative or competitive. And if it is competitive, how is it competitive? So cooperative games where players work together to accomplish a goal can include things like Dungeons and Dragons, Munchkin, Pandemic. Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop RPG where a party will play out a story. Munchkin is a card game form of an RPG, so it's very similar, but you have a party of players who are attempting to beat the board. And Pandemic is a game where a group of players is trying to stop a disease from ravaging the world. Contrast that to competitive games where players are playing against each other, trying to be the one person who wins or the one team that wins. You have games like Magic, chess, Catan, where you play the game, and at the end of the game, you can define who has won and who has lost. Um, in which ways are these games competitive? So, in direct conflict, players tend to interact or hinder or attack each other directly through actions in the game. When you play a miniature game like Warhammer or Yu-Gi-Oh, a trading card game, or even chess or checkers, you are playing against an opponent, and your goal is to defeat that opponent. Indirect conflict, on the other hand, is when players indirectly affect directly affect the game state, the game board, but indirectly affect other players to try to win the game. This can be I use Agricola, Ticket to Ride, Dominion. These are all games that are actually very similar to Catan in their theory, but the idea is you're gathering resources and whatnot, and you're not directly interfering with what other players are doing, but you're trying to gain control of the most of whatever the victory the victory condition is. Another very good example I bring back to Monopoly for indirect conflict, because Monopoly is a game where you are concerned about your own wealth and how to increase that amount of wealth and property that you own. You are not directly affecting other players' ability to play the game. However, there are turning points in the game where you will interact with players to do things such as charge them rent on your properties, buy things from them, things like that. Depending on your house rules, there are a lot of things you can do in Monopoly that can affect other players, either directly or indirectly. All right, so next up, we have resource management. Resource management is something that, in an abstract way, you can find in any game you play. Like I said before, whether it's the number of pieces that you have in checkers, or the number of cards in your deck in Magic, or Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh, or if it's actually the number of resources that you control in a game like Settlers of Catan. Resource management provides a really deep pool of strategy and interaction within your game that allows players to customize their own experience. Resource management leads to a lot of decision making. How do I gain more resources? How do I preserve my resources for game or for moves in the future? How do I prevent other players from taking my resources, or how do I take other players' resources? A lot of resource management can lead to a lot of customization in a game. So go back to trading card games, where resource management starts from when you design the deck you're playing. How many copies of a single card should I play, or how many cards should I have total in my deck? These are things that matter. How am I going to interact with my opponent's life total, or number of cards in their deck or in their hand or in play at any time? This starts from when you build your deck, when you start the game, to when you win or lose the game at the end. Resource management in self-contained board games can range from, like I said, with your Settlers of Catan, controlling resources, playing a deck building game where you are building your deck, your card deck, as you're playing the game. How do I get more cards? How many cards do I want? How do I play more cards? How do I gain those victory points? In something like a tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, your resources can things that you have to manage as a player include the size of your party, the amount of health you have, your armor rating, your your different supplies you have, number of arrows or magic spell slots that you have in D&D. These are all things that you have to constantly be tracking and managing throughout your gameplay and trying to figure out a way to maximize their effectiveness on the overall game itself. On the flip side, for tabletop RPGs, you also have DMs, dungeon masters, game masters that have to manage resources or all of the enemy pieces, all of the story components, and things like that. And the last thing for different basic components in a game are your scoring and your victory conditions. So this slide breaks down kind of common ways that you would decide how somebody wins, but it all boils down to deciding how the game ends. In the case of competitive games where players are playing against each other, it's a lot easier. You look at number of points scored or the number of resources collected, or if there's only one player left in the game, they win, things like that. Whereas it can be a little bit more abstract and like or it can be a little bit easier and direct to decide on like a cooperative game where it's, we're trying to complete a goal. Did we complete that goal? If we did, then we win. If we didn't, then we lose. Tabletop RPGs, did we complete the story? Did our entire party die in the middle of a dungeon? These are the things that determine whether or not a player or players have won a game. In addition to kind of the basic ideas laid out here, there are other things that can determine winners in games. Chess has multiple win conditions that are considered victories without being outright victories. You see that a lot more in known solved games than you do in games with some amount of randomness or chance. So this is a quick example of game mechanics you find in classic board games. I've talked a lot about chess. Chess has a very clear objective of capturing your opponent's king or getting them into a position where they can't, where they will be captured. All of the pieces are known. All of your resources are managed by the number of pieces and which ones they are, which ones they represent in a game. If you've ever watched chess or followed any amount of chess, you'll know that individual pieces have what's considered point values that kind of gives you an idea of who's leading and who's not in your resource management. Checkers is very similar. How many pieces do I have in play? How many of those are kings? So how many of those have more abilities? How many options do I have to capture my opponent's pieces? Monopoly, I've talked extensively as well. We have a lot of resource management and victory point goal-oriented victory conditions, having the most money at the end of the game, having the most value in your assets, or being the last player to not be bankrupt. Uno is another classic one that is a very simple version of resource management. The only thing you really have to worry about is how many cards you have in your hand and how to get those cards out of your hand. So your interaction with other players is playing cards like your wild draw fours or your draw twos, reverses, skips to disrupt what they're doing, and trying to the strategy that you're trying to obtain is to figure out how to get those cards out of your hand before everybody else does. So let's bring all this together and talk a little bit about balancing. So I'm going to go much further into detail on balancing gameplay and mechanics, rules and components in a game later on in this course. However, I want to talk a little bit about this because when you look at your basic mechanics, you need to make sure that they're all represented in ways that hit these big bullet points, which is to say fairness, complexity, engagement, and variety. So fairness, you want to make sure that whatever your rules, your interactions, and your resource management and your scoring mechanics, whatever those are, that they are all fair to all the players. Players have equal access to the ability to perform or do or achieve these things. This can go from something like a solved game like chess, where everyone has the same pieces at the beginning of the game, and everyone knows exactly where those pieces are at the beginning of a game. They need to use their skill to win. Versus something, I guess, as multifaceted as a trading card game, where the fairness comes from everyone having access in a shape or form to a card pool that you can build your decks from. I'm not saying that everybody has access to the same cards, but they have the opportunity to have access to the same cards, which is to say, if you were playing a Magic booster draft, everyone is opening booster packs of a set, and as long as those packs are fair between them and there's no loaded cards in any of them, then that is fairness. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who wants to play the most expensive cards in the game should have access to those cards without outside influence. Next is complexity. We want to keep a game engaging and challenging, but we don't want to confuse players while we're playing it. So when you add mechanics to your game, when you add actions, interactivity, rules, you want to make sure that those things make sense in in the scope of your game, without bogging it down too much by having players ask questions like what does this mean? There are very complex games that complexity adds to its charm, or as to its enjoyment. Trading card games being one, tabletop RPGs being another good example, where there are a lot of things in a game of Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons. I like Pathfinder as an example because there's hundreds of books. In a game of Pathfinder, there's near infinite amounts of ways to combine things to create characters or encounters, or gameplay interactions that are used, when used effectively, heighten the experience versus bogging it down by having a bunch of different things that players have to keep track of, or players have to know that these things exist in the game. Next is engagement. You want to make sure that the things that you add to your game keep players engaged. You don't want anyone getting bored while they're playing your game, and you want to kind of create a interest in replaying the game. When you play when you play something like something solved like chess or checkers, the gameplay itself tends to keep players engaged because strategies and stuff play out in real time, versus something with too simplistic mechanics allowing repetitiveness to set in more quickly. I like to look at tic-tac-toe. I think tic-tac-toe might be the worst game ever designed, because if you look at it from the scope of what is a game, it meets the benchmarks. So you have mechanics, interaction, and you have a way of winning, and player decisions affect the result of the game. However, there are so few decisions to be made in a game of tic-tac-toe that there are not very many end results to the game. So there's not very many spots within gameplay to create strategy. So you want to keep players engaged, and you want to keep gameplay varied enough that it keeps players coming back to play again, which leads into our next point, variety. You want to have enough variety in what players can do, how they can interact with your game, and um, how they win the game, so that it's not too predictable. Um, if a player plays the exact same way every single game and gets the exact same result for playing that way, then there is no there's no reason for them to keep playing that game, or for people to keep playing that game with them, because the result will end the same. See this a lot in games with evolving uh, component bases, like trading card games or miniature games, where you'll have things that are banned so you can't use them, or their rules are changed so they work differently in a way to prevent everyone from doing the same thing and having every result of every game being the same way. And that's going to be it. I have these additional resources here at the end of this presentation as a way, if you're interested in learning some more things, and broadening your horizons for different games that exist. These are some really good resources. BoardGameGeek.com is a database of tabletop games that has a lot going on in it. Different content created for the games, reviews, unboxings, components, all that stuff. Um, I've linked Mark Rosewater's blog for the as lead designer of Magic. He has a lot of really good insights in game design. He's worked in that position, I think, now for 30 years, 28 years. And then there's also this YouTube channel, The Dice Tower. They're a very good channel, and they do game reviews, gameplay, and other game related content for tabletop gaming. Thanks everybody for listening to this lecture. I will be back for next week's lecture. Until then, see you guys later.